Welcome back to Israel Matters, everyone. It's good to see everybody. Meaning all I can see is Elliot Chodoff, but it's good to see you, Elliot.
Good to see
and
you.
welcome back, everyone. We're to our discussions of what matters most to Israel. This week, of course, is the week of Tisha B'Av, the 9th of the month of Av. We mentioned this last time in relation to my growth, that this is a period of mourning, a period of contemplation of Jewish history. And the weight of Jewish history. This is what we're immersed in at this time of year. And in light of that, Elliot and I have decided that we are going to take a break from talking about current events and even the big picture background of current events, as we were talking about last time, and really discuss Tisha B'Av and the Jewish historical memory that is associated with Tisha B'Av and some of those lessons. I just want to share a brief thought, and then I'm going to pass it over to Elliot. And I wrote this up a number of years ago in the Times of Israel, but it's a while ago, and just want to share this interesting nugget. In the year 1771, the first edition of the Encyclopedia Britannica was published in Edinburgh, Scotland. And it's not very big. It's not like the current Encyclopedia Britannica, which is many, many volumes. It was the first edition. It was 3 volumes. And on page 833 of volume 2 is the entry for the word Jews. And I saw a copy of this. My father-in-law has a facsimile edition of it that was given to him as a gift. And the first thing I did when I saw it was I looked up Jews. Like, what in the 18th century, when some British academics were writing the first encyclopedia, what did they write for Jews? And listen to what they wrote. And they only wrote 150 words. Just imagine, Elliot, that you were given an assignment that you had to write an encyclopedia entry for the word Jews, and you only had 150 words.
I can't say good morning in 150 words.
Right, exactly. I mean, but think about that. It's a very interesting thing. 150 words, someone had to write this entry. And they had to think about what are the few details that we're going to give that define and give background and let the reader know what Jews are. Are you curious now, Elliot?
You got me.
So listen to this. This is the entire entry. I'll read it beginning to end. Jews, those who profess obedience to the laws and religion of Moses. So far, so good. Good opening sentence.
Yep.
When a modern Jew builds a house, he must leave part of it unfinished in remembrance that the temple and Jerusalem now lie desolate. They lay great stress upon frequent washings. They abstain from meat prohibited by Levitical law, for which reason whatever they eat must be dressed, meaning prepared, by Jews after a manner peculiar to themselves. Every Jew is obliged to marry. A man who lives to 20 unmarried is accounted as actually living in sin. The Jews, it is said, were formerly at the disposal of the chief lord where they lived, and likewise all their goods. A Jew may be a witness by our law, being sworn on the Old Testament and taking oaths to the government. Now, the last 2 sentences deal with the status of Jews in British law at that time.
Right.
The opening sentence is simply a general statement about what Jews are. And in between those two, we have 4 examples of Jewish practice to tell the reader what a Jew is. Right? And it includes kashrut, Jewish dietary laws about what we can eat and what we can't eat. It includes frequent washings, which may be a reference to laws of family purity, ritual baths and immersions,
washing before bread.
Jews wash their hands before they eat. So those are very visible and prominent practices that are pretty much every day. And then there's the reference to marriage, which displays the importance of family building in Jewish culture.
Right.
But before all of those, the very first sentence that was written was this custom that a Jew will leave a part of his home unfinished as a way of remembering that the temple and Jerusalem are destroyed. Now that's a very obscure, from your perspective, Elliot. You and I are both Orthodox.
I would not have added that as a description.
Of course not. Never in a million years. If you gave,
Right.
if you took, just for everyone listening, those who aren't Jewish who are watching this, if you took 100 Jews and gave them this assignment, write half a dozen practices that define Jews as Jews. Probably the Passover Seder would be in there.
Yeah.
Shabbat would probably be
Shabbat.
in there. And the other things mentioned here, kashrut, Jewish dietary laws, praying 3 times a day. There's other things that we could have thought of. This happens to be a practice that has been practiced for Jews for centuries. And what the practice really is that a piece of one's home will maybe be left unplastered as a way of saying, like, just as the temple is not built, my home is also not fully built. It's a way of remembering the destruction. Now, to me, what's interesting here is not what this says about British intellectuals who are writing the Encyclopedia Britannica, but what it says about the Jews at that time, meaning because whoever wrote this entry was thinking about what are the most distinctive characteristics of Jews. And the first thing they put in was that Jews remember and commemorate that memory. They enshrine it, so to speak, in their homes. They remember that the temple and Jerusalem are not built, that they are in a state of destruction. And that kind of historical memory really speaks volumes about what defines Jews. That the fact that we have a long historical memory is a strength and something that keeps us going. It's amazing to me, and it makes me wonder if someone was writing an encyclopedia entry about me, about us, a few hundred years from now, what would be in it? So I thought that was an appropriate nugget to share in light of Tisha B'Av, which really highlights the importance of remembering the bad times, because it keeps our focus on what needs to be fixed in the world.
Absolutely. Thinking about it, it occurs to me that it was probably a prominent knowledge because the people building for Jews were not Jewish. The architects, the masons, the carpenters, whomever.
So this was something that outsiders would have known.
Yes,
that's interesting.
But to me, what's striking is not just that they would know it, that the Jewish homeowner client not only would tell them not to finish something, but would explain why.
Interesting.
To me, that's a key point, because you could tell your contract, do me a favor, just leave the corner unfinished. Why? Because I'm a little crazy.
Right. They obviously explained it, and this was known. But so it's again, this spoke very powerfully to me when I first read it, and I think it really speaks to who we are as Jews.
Yes.
A number of weeks back, we were talking about the incident of the spies, and you mentioned at the time that there was something you wanted to talk about closer to Tisha B'Av.
Right. So let me just start by referencing back something that I mentioned last week, 2 weeks ago, Santayana's famous quote.
It was last week, yeah.
He who cannot remember the past is condemned to repeat it. I'd like to talk about Tisha B'Av via the spies, because we look at the 9th of Av as an event in its own right, and it is, but it's also a consequence. And this is, I think, part of the memory of the past and not repeating it is taking the event back to, at least by commentary, if not deeper than that, to its origins. And the origins of Tisha B'Av actually is the story of the spies.
Meaning, when you say the origin of the origin of the destruction
of the destruction, temple. Right? The origin of the commemorative date for what it is, a day of mourning, goes back to the spies. And we read through it, and we've talked about this. Of course, the translations don't do it justice, but even reading through it in Hebrew, if you don't do it carefully, you miss very important nuances. And I'd like to go through aspects of it, not for the purpose of repeating the story, but rather as a teaching tool for contemporary issues as well. It begins by God telling Moses, "Shlach lecha anashim," send people for yourself.
Yeah, it's an interesting syntax.
Right? In other words, I don't need it. I know what's going on there. You need it. Now, the interesting question is, why does Moses need it? Let's hold that for a moment. The next words are latur et haaretz, and it's interesting. The Hebrew word and the English word are identical. Latur, to tour the land. As you know, the word spies does not appear anywhere in that chapter.
That's true.
We attribute it. We add that word in the description, but the word spies only really appears when Joshua sends spies to Jericho to conquer the city, because their mission, and here's part of the teaching moment, if you will, their mission is not to determine whether or not to take Jericho. Their mission is to determine how to take Jericho.
It was a military mission. It was real reconnaissance.
It was a military mission whose objective was, let's figure out how we are going to do this, not let's ask ourselves if we are going to do this. And I'll just add parenthetically, everybody studies for the test. In other words, if I tell you this is what you're looking for, that's what you're going to find, at least categorically. You may find some of this or some of that, but I'm setting the category for you. Send people to tour the land, and I know that many of our watchers have toured Israel. There's a difference in commitment between a tourist and someone who's coming on a mission to do something. And a tourist has no commitment. Now, they may have a higher commitment somewhere, but the tour itself has only a passing kind of commitment to it. And the question is, why are these people being sent to tour? If we look at who they are, it answers all of these questions together. And I know you're familiar with this. We've both used it and heard it many times, and particularly for our Christian viewers who, I think we have to say honestly, know scripture chapter and verse better than most of our Jewish compatriots, at least in terms of reciting it by heart.
Often they do.
We know that there are 12 spies. Everybody knows the name of two of them, Joshua and Caleb, who were the ones who came back and said, let's go, let's do it. This is what we need to do. The 10 who said no are written, their names are listed, nobody knows them. And of course, the obvious lesson is if you speak out against the land and you speak out against the destiny of the land, you're going to be forgotten even if your names are written in the book. But to me, beyond that, I mean, that's an interesting quirk. But beyond that is, who are these people? These are the leaders of the tribes. Who sends tribal leaders as spies? When Joshua sends those two guys into Jericho, he picks two guys who, I mean, I assume that he chose capable people, he knew who they were and that sort of thing, but they weren't people of status. In other words, the reason Moses has to send them in the first place is because they're already speaking out against going. And God basically says, listen, you need to send people because you're not convincing them. Now, part of the lesson here is that if they're going in order to prove their own argument, it was a doomed mission from the outset. You can't send somebody who is arguing against a case and say, well, go look at it and you'll see that I'm right and you're wrong. It'll happen on occasion.
Just to emphasize your point, right there in the verse, in verse 20, and this is, of course, this whole story takes place in the book of Numbers, chapter 13, and right there in verse 20, where Moses is giving the instructions to what we call the spies, to these men, these nobles, really, who were going to go into the land, he says to them, they should check out the quality of the soil, bring back some of the fruit. These are not things that you do if it's a military mission.
Correct.
He wants them to come back with this glowing report of how fertile the soil is and how beautiful the fruit is. Obviously, this is a PR mission.
Exactly. And he's hoping that they'll be convinced. In other words, he's giving them directions that he believes will be sufficient to convince them. And they come back with all of the evidence and interpret exactly the opposite way that he wants. I think there's a very important lesson here for us as well. I know you get into discussions on the issues that we're talking about. I'm talking in general in our talks. I certainly get into a lot of them when I'm speaking, and many people begin their comments to me with, well, if I were them, I would. And whether the them is the Iranians or Hezbollah or Hamas or the Palestinians, the Syrians, whomever, back in the day, Saddam Hussein, the Iraqis, if I were Saddam Hussein, I would. And I always stop them at that point and say, but you're not Saddam Hussein. He could look at exactly the same data that you're looking at and come to 180-degree opposite conclusions. Don't think that what is self-evident to you is necessarily self-evident to somebody else. And part of the error here, if you will, and criticizing it now just in terms of decision-making and selection, taking a bunch of people and sending them off, leaders who've already staked out a position, and sending them off and saying, well, look, just go see for yourself and come back and you'll draw the right conclusion. It just doesn't work that way. We know what happens in the end. They come back and they convince the people. And here's another very interesting phenomenon. We see it today as well. The power of negative speech, the power of negative declarations is far, far greater than the power of positive.
Well, fear is a powerful tool, rhetorical.
Fear, negativity. There's a natural tendency not to act, not to take action, not to take initiative. And if somebody can justify that for you, especially a leader, then so much the better. And if they play into those fears, and we see that, again, without going into details with what's going on in America and in Israel today, how easy it is, obviously facilitated by mass media and social media, to play into people's fears with rumors, with conspiracy theories. You can't keep up with them. And here, if you read the 10 report, it's essentially a conspiracy theory. They tell the people, we were seen in their eyes as if we were grasshoppers. In other words, how do you know how they saw you? This is how they saw themselves being seen by them back on themselves. Now, an analysis brings you there very quickly. The people say, oh my God, these are giants, we're bugs. And it's very, very easy to do that. Last but not least, I mentioned that the destruction and all of that, all of those things, and we'll talk about them in a moment, that happened on the 9th of Av are a consequence. In other words, the spies are really the triggering action. Because, as you know, the commentaries say that when the people cry out, and actually, let me back up a step. When I used to teach this here and in the United States in college classes, I would always ask the students, Jewish and Christian, what was the great sin of the desert? And 95% of them would give the Sissel B. DeMille answer, which is the golden calf. In fact, this is the sin of the desert. The golden calf was a sin, but this is the sin. This is what brings the 40 years, which is the great punishment.
Right, that whole generation was not doomed to die because of the sin of the golden calf.
Correct.
God
Only
forgave
those who
them,
are
and right, this was the sin that doomed them.
Right, and this is collective across the boards, that God says to them, because you cried when you should have rejoiced, I will make this a day of tears for all your generations. You're not going into the land. Your children who you said would die are the ones who will inherit. In other words, there's something very powerful here in the message that's beyond just, you did something wrong, I'm going to punish you. There's a huge impact on the whole rest of this story, because this was supposed to be a holiday. We're going into the land of Israel. And let me just add parenthetically, I would argue, and I'll argue this on a very narrow point, the whole purpose of the Exodus is to bring them into the land of Israel.
Of course, yeah.
Right? I mean, all the other stuff happens, but the only thing God can't do in Egypt is bring them into the land of Israel. He can free them from slavery, he can give them the Torah, he can unite them as a people, he can do also all of that in Egypt. Physically, they can't be in Egypt and in the land of Israel. The Exodus is to get them to the land of Israel. And here they are at that critical moment of what it was all about, and they say, no, we're not going. So he says, oh, you're not going? I'll teach you. You're not going, forget about it. Your children will, but forever this day will be remembered. And we know, of course, the three major early events that are attributed to this date: the destruction of both the first and the second temples, the crushing of the Bar Kokhba rebellion in 135, and the death of Bar Kokhba, which in many ways is the other end of the bookends of the destruction of the temple in terms of the exile. Okay, the first temple destruction, the people go into exile to Babylonia. After the destruction of the second temple, many Jews are still living here in the land of Israel. The exile really starts with the fall of Bar Kokhba. Mm-hmm. Which is why Rabbi Yehuda writes the Mishnah right afterwards, because he knows it's happening. In other words, we have lots of indicators that's really the anchor that gets ripped out, even more so in terms of exile, even more so than the destruction of Jerusalem. And another event, and there are others, but I want to bring it up to date and leave it with that, is that there's a 20th century event that also happened on the 9th of Av. It was cataclysmic for basically the entire world ultimately, but it had disproportionate impact on the Jewish people. And that was the outbreak of World War I. It could easily be argued, and maybe it's not for here, that the 20th century began the outbreak of World War I on August 1st, 1914. And the 20th century, if we're looking from a Jewish perspective, is marked as the century of the elimination of the European Jewish community. Now, there are Jews still living in Europe today, but there's no European Jewish community. It's a tiny shadow of what it was.
Well, more importantly, it's not the center of gravity of the Jewish Jewish world, or a center of gravity. It's a satellite. It's not.
It's even less than a satellite. In other words, there are Jews living there, but the idea of a European Jewish community is gone. It started in World War I. Many Jews were killed. We don't talk about them because the Holocaust so overshadowed it. The emigration as a result of that, then of course the Holocaust is the final step, the massive step of the destruction. But all of that is a consequence of the outbreak of World War I in 1914. In other words, Tisha B'Av 1914 is the date that begins the destruction of European Jewry. And I mention that because there's a tendency to think about these things only in ancient times, stuff that happened 2,000 years ago. It's not a coincidence, as you know, that Jews don't do anything of any great importance on the 9th of Av. Because you know what? It's a better day than usual to get slapped.
I'm wondering now, just maybe we could close this out. I'm wondering now with what you mentioned about the sin of the spies being on the 9th of Av, and World War I in the 20th century being on the 9th of Av, if the connection might be the fact that the Zionist movement and the national movement to go back to the land of Israel really gets going towards the end of the previous century, towards the end of the 19th century, and you have the first Zionist Congress in 1897, 1897, which is not long before. And European Jewry was not as on the bandwagon to go back to the land of Israel as it should have been. And perhaps with the benefit of the distance, of the historical distance we now have, we could argue that there was some element of not being excited about going into the land, some element of the original sin of the spies that was still infecting the Jewish people around that time. Elliot, are you there? Looks like we had a bit of a Zoom freeze here. Hello? It looks like I lost Elliot. Well, folks, I think on that note, we're going to end our conversation here for today. Thank you very much for watching. Sometimes with our technology as it is these days, we encounter such problems. So everyone stay safe. And remember, this coming Thursday is the 9th of Av, and that is a day that we commemorate, we really contemplate a lot of the things that have happened in our history, in Jewish history, and in world history, that have brought about some of that which is broken that we need to fix in the building of the kingdom of God on this earth. So thank you for watching, and may we all see the Messiah come speedily in our days.